93 years old widow donated late husband $1 billion to cover school tuition, NYCs poorest area forever. Evelyn's small Brooklyn apartment was already warm when the first light spilled across the cracked linoleum floor. Dust floated in the slant of morning sun like tiny drifting planets, catching on the edges of the clutter that lined every surface. Old mugs with cold tea rings, a chipped porcelain bird, stacks of yellowing mail, each thing left exactly where she could reach it. She moved slowly, her joints crackling like old paper, shuffling across the floor in her felt slippers. She paused by the shelf near the window, where a small framed photo of her husband sat, the glass slightly smudged from the way her fingers often traced the edge of his cheek. His smile was still as bright as the day they had taken that picture, at Coney Island, nearly 70 years ago. The window was stuck again, the wooden frame swollen from last week's rain. She gripped the latch with trembling hands, tugging once, twice, as the metal scraped and squeaked in protest. Her breath came in short puffs, and she could feel her pulse in the soft hollow of her neck, a reminder that even breathing was heavier than it used to be. Outside, she could hear the pigeons gathering on the fire escape, cooing softly, rustling their wings. She wanted to let in the breeze. The apartment smelled of old wood and stale air, and the warmth was pressing on her skin like a thick blanket. "Come on," she whispered, her fingers gripping the frame. She tugged again, harder this time, the window jerking suddenly upward. A sharp gust of cool morning air rushed inside, and in that sudden movement, the framed photo slid off the shelf, hitting the floor with a soft thud and a crack that seemed to echo in the small room. "Oh," she breathed. She bent down slowly, knees protesting, lifting the frame with careful fingers. A hairline crack splintered across the glass, cutting across her husband's smiling face. Her thumb brushed across it, and she felt her eyes sting, though she blinked the wetness away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thin. She sat down in the chair by the window, the cool air brushing across her cheeks, stirring the wisps of white hair around her face. The pigeons were still there, pecking at the railing, indifferent to her presence. Holding the cracked photo in her lap, Evelyn looked out at the street below, where a delivery truck rumbled past and a mother tugged her child's hand across the crosswalk. Life was moving, even if she was slowing. She traced her husband's face with her fingertip, following the crack across his cheek like a road. "I need to do something before I join you," she whispered, closing her eyes for a moment as the morning light warmed her face, letting the breeze fill the room with the scent of the city she had loved and suffered in for nearly a century. The cemetery in Queens was quiet, except for the distant rumble of a bus engine and the soft rustle of trees swaying under the summer breeze. Grass grew tall between the crooked stones, brushing against Evelyn's ankles as she made her slow way along the narrow path. She could smell the wet earth where last night's rain still clung to the ground, leaving dark stains across the cracked walkway. She paused to catch her breath near the iron fence, one hand pressed against her chest, the other gripping the handle of her cane. A sparrow darted across the path, landing on the edge of a headstone before disappearing into the branches above. She found his grave easily. She always did. The stone was simple, gray, etched with a name that once commanded construction crews across the city, Anthony Moretti. Below it, the words "beloved husband" were carved, the letters softened by time and weather. Evelyn lowered herself onto the small wooden stool she brought with her, the legs sinking slightly into the damp ground. She laid her cane across her lap, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. No one was. No one ever was. She reached out, letting her thin, shaking fingers trace the letters of his name. The stone was cold, and the chill seeped into her skin, but she did not pull her hand away. "Anthony," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the rustling leaves overhead. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting herself feel the breeze, the earth, the weight of everything she had carried alone these past 20 years. The loneliness settled in her bones like an old ache, but beneath it was something sharper, something restless. She opened her eyes and looked at the grave, gripping the edge of the stone to steady herself. Slowly, she leaned forward, bending at the waist, ignoring the sharp protest of her knees and hips as she tried to kneel. Her breath caught, and she had to pause halfway, her body trembling as she forced herself lower. "I know what you wanted," she said, her voice low, nearly lost under the hiss of the wind through the trees. "Another building, another name on a corner somewhere." She shook her head, a small, tired smile on her lips as she looked at the stone. "But they don't need another building with your name." She could feel the earth pressing into her knees, damp and cold, reminding her she was alive, reminding her that she still had time, however little. They need something real. A bird called out in the distance, the sound carrying across the empty cemetery. Evelyn lifted her head, letting the air fill her lungs, tasting the scent of wet grass and rain-soaked soil. "I'm going to use it, Anthony," she whispered. "All of it." The leaves above rustled again, a soft applause, or maybe just the wind. She placed her hand flat against the stone one last time before pressing her lips gently to the top edge, the cold granite grounding her, reminding her of the promise she was making, not to him, but to the children she saw waiting on street corners with empty backpacks and tired eyes. She would use the money right. Before she joined him, Evelyn stood near the rusted bus stop sign, her cane planted firmly on the cracked pavement. The morning air smelled of bus fumes and damp concrete, mixed with the faint sweetness of a corner bodega's pastries. The street was alive with the distant wail of a siren, a reminder that the day was already unfolding, whether anyone was ready or not. Across the street, near the worn fence of a rundown elementary school, 3 children sat on the curb, their feet dangling above the gutter. Their backpacks were nearly as big as they were, scuffed and patched, zippers barely holding together. A girl with tight braids pulled her knees to her chest, while a boy in a too-small jacket poked at a crack in the sidewalk with a stick. The third, the smallest, wore a pink jacket with a broken zipper, her shoes untied, her eyes fixed on the corner. They were waiting for a bus that was late, again. Evelyn watched, her hand gripping the handle of her cane tighter as she leaned forward slightly, trying to catch their words. The boy in the jacket sighed, dropping the stick, his small shoulders slumping under the weight of a burden he shouldn't have known. "I can't go today," he said softly to the girl with the braids. She looked at him, confusion and worry crossing her face. "Why not?" He picked at the frayed strap of his backpack, not meeting her eyes. "Mama didn't get the check." The words settled in the air like dust, heavy and choking. The smallest girl looked between them, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She just hugged her backpack closer, pressing her cheek against the faded fabric. Evelyn felt her eyes sting as she blinked, hard. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she was somewhere else, standing in front of a chalkboard, years and years ago, looking at children with the same tired eyes, the same hungry hope, children she couldn't help because the world had decided their worth was measured in what their parents could pay. She had left that job to help Anthony build his empire, believing she would return to teaching someday. But someday had come and gone, and those children had grown up without her. The siren in the distance grew louder before fading, leaving a hollow quiet. The bus finally turned the corner, brakes hissing, doors opening with a mechanical sigh. The girl with the braids stood, pulling the smallest girl up with her. The boy stayed seated, clutching his backpack, eyes down. The girls hesitated, looking back at him. The driver honked once, impatient. They climbed aboard, glancing back as the bus pulled away, leaving the boy alone on the curb, kicking at the broken concrete. Evelyn felt something inside her tighten, a silent promise wrapping around her heart like a thread pulling her forward. She could not let them be left behind again. The small apartment was quiet except for the steady tick of the old clock on the wall, each second like a soft knock in the darkness. A single yellow lamp cast a pool of light across the kitchen table, turning the edges of Evelyn's shadow into a wavering halo on the linoleum floor. She sat in her thin housecoat, the night pressing against the windows, the city's hum muffled by the heavy curtains she never opened after dark. Before her lay her old leather-bound ledger, the corners worn soft from years of handling, the spine cracked from being opened to the same pages over and over. Evelyn's hands moved slowly as she flipped through the ledger, the paper whispering under her fingers, yellowed and brittle, filled with neat columns of figures written in Anthony's precise, sharp handwriting. A record of deals and projects that had built skyscrapers across the city, that had pulled him from the docks to the glass offices high above the streets. She glanced toward the corner of the room, where a small safe sat on the floor, its paint chipped, a layer of dust softening its edges. It had been there for years, so much a part of the apartment that it felt like another piece of furniture. Most days she didn't even look at it. Tonight, she couldn't look away. The key hung on a thin chain around her neck, hidden beneath her collar. Her hands shook as she lifted it, slipping it into the lock. The metal was cold against her skin, and she paused for a moment. the ticking of the clock growing louder, pressing into the silence. Click! The safe door creaked open, releasing a breath of musty air that smelled of old paper and something metallic, like coins left in a drawer too long. Inside, folders were stacked in careful order, envelopes sealed and labeled in Anthony's hand. At the very back, wrapped in brown paper, was the ledger she had never shown anyone, not even the lawyers. She lifted it, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, and placed it on the table. Carefully, she unwrapped it, revealing the neat rows of numbers, the account details, the hidden transactions that led to the offshore account Anthony had built quietly, away from the city, away from taxes, away from eyes. $1 billion. She had known it was there for years, but the reality of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. It had been the reason Anthony had worked until the day he collapsed in his office, the reason he missed birthdays, dinners, their anniversary the year before he died. She ran her fingers across the columns of numbers, the ink faded but still legible. The ticking of the clock seemed to slow, each second heavy in the warm lamplight. She could keep it. She could live comfortably until the end, leave something to distant cousins who barely remembered her name. Or... Her eyes closed, and she saw the boy on the curb, his backpack clutched to his chest, waiting for a bus he couldn't take. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening on the paper. "This money killed you," she whispered into the silence, her voice rough, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe it can save them." The clock ticked on. And Evelyn made her choice. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the small office, buzzing softly over the chatter of children drifting in from the hallway. The walls were lined with faded posters, "Attendance matters, college starts here, you are capable," their edges curling from years of humid summers and cold winters pressing against the old building. Ms. Rivera sat behind a scratched wooden desk, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, a pen tapping lightly against a stack of permission slips waiting for signatures. She looked tired, the kind of tired that settled in her shoulders and eyes, but there was still a brightness beneath it, a spark that hadn't yet gone out. Across from her, Evelyn sat in a stiff plastic chair, her cane resting against her knee. She had dressed carefully, pulling on her best cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and pinning her hair back so it wouldn't fall into her eyes. Her hands were folded over her purse, steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I know you're busy," Evelyn began, her voice calm, steady. Ms. Rivera glanced up from the papers, offering a polite smile. "It's all right, Mrs. Moretti. What can I do for you?" Evelyn took a breath, glancing toward the door where children's laughter echoed, sneakers squeaking on the tile floors. "I want to pay for their tuition," she said simply. Ms. Rivera blinked. "I'm sorry." "I want to pay for all of them," Evelyn repeated. "Every child here, and in every school like this, forever." The pen stopped tapping. Ms. Rivera leaned back in her chair, studying the woman in front of her as if waiting for the punchline. "Mrs. Moretti, that's..." She shook her head, a small, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "Do you know how big that is? The city will never let it happen." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need the city's permission." Ms. Rivera's brow furrowed. "Even if you have money, there are rules, systems, processes. You can't just walk in and..." "I don't want permission," Evelyn interrupted softly, her voice steady. "I want them to go to school." For a moment, the hum of the lights and the laughter in the hallway filled the silence between them. Ms. Rivera looked down at the stack of forms on her desk, the signatures waiting, the children behind each name. She looked up again, seeing not just a frail old woman, but something else in Evelyn's eyes, a determination that did not match her age, a quiet, fierce promise. "How?" Ms. Rivera asked, her voice softer now. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the edge of her purse. "That's what I need your help with." Outside, the bell rang, and the chatter in the halls swelled, a wave of sound that filled the room with the urgency of a new day beginning. Ms. Rivera glanced toward the door, then back at Evelyn, the weight of the children they both cared for pressing into the space between them. Ms. Rivera let out a breath, a tired smile returning to her face. "All right," she said quietly, "let's see what we can do." The small law office smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, the air heavy with the scent of aging leather chairs that creaked whenever someone shifted. Files were stacked on every available surface, folders poking out at odd angles, yellow sticky notes fluttering under the soft draft from the humming air conditioner. Mr. Kaplan sat behind his wide oak desk, glasses perched on the end of his nose as he flipped through the folder Evelyn had handed him. His hair was more silver than white now, combed neatly back, and his suit jacket hung on the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up over thin, veined arms. Evelyn sat across from him, her cane leaning against the armrest, her purse settled in her lap. The folder between them felt heavier than it should have, the numbers and account statements inside a quiet weight pressing on the space. "So," Mr. Kaplan said, clearing his throat as he adjusted his glasses, "you want to set up a trust fund to pay for children's tuition, permanently?" Evelyn nodded once. "That's right." He let out a slow breath, tapping the folder lightly against the desk. "Evelyn, you realize what you're asking? This isn't a few scholarships. This is massive. There will be red tape, city approvals, tax complications, probably family disputes if anyone gets wind of this. I need to be honest with you." She met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "I know." Mr. Kaplan leaned back, the chair groaning. "You could keep this, live comfortably. Donate in smaller amounts. Let it go through the usual channels." "I don't want usual," Evelyn replied softly, her voice calm against the ticking clock on the wall. "I want it to matter." The lawyer's eyes softened as he studied her, the woman he had known for decades, who had once come into his office with her husband to sign the papers for a tiny house they could barely afford. Now she was here alone, older, frailer, but there was something unyielding in the way she sat, her spine straight, her eyes clear. "You know, you'll be making yourself a target," he said quietly. "People will have opinions. They'll question everything. They'll try to take advantage." Evelyn's hand rested on the edge of the folder, fingers brushing the paper as if grounding herself in the promise she was making. She could hear the faint drip of the coffee pot in the corner, the scent comforting, reminding her of mornings long past when Anthony would sit with his cup, reading the paper before disappearing for another long day. "It's all I have left to give," she said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled just slightly. Mr. Kaplan was silent for a moment, then nodded, sliding the folder closer as he reached for a pen. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." Outside the small window behind him, the city moved on, unaware that a promise was being written quietly in a room filled with dusty files and the faint smell of old coffee, a promise that would change everything. The apartment was still, the early morning light soft against the faded curtains. Dust danced in narrow beams across the kitchen counter, catching on the rim of a teacup that sat, half-finished, from the night before. The quiet was broken by the sudden, sharp buzz of the phone on the table. It rattled against the wood, the vibration echoing in the silence, a sound that seemed too loud for the small, quiet space. Evelyn glanced at it, her hand pausing on the kettle she was about to lift, steam curling upward in a gentle spiral. The screen lit up with an unknown number. She hesitated, then pressed the green button, bringing the phone slowly to her ear. "Mrs. Moretti?" A young voice, eager, crackling with the energy of someone who had run up the office stairs to make this call. "Yes?" Evelyn's voice was calm, her gaze drifting to the window where the morning was unfolding, slow and pink over the rooftops. "This is Clara Torres with the City Post. I'm calling about your donation. The $1 billion tuition fund." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling a soft, tired breath. So it had leaked. "Mrs. Moretti, this is an incredible story," Clara continued, her words spilling over each other in excitement. "We would love to get a statement, or even better, an interview. We want people to know who you are, why you're doing this." Evelyn turned slightly, looking across the room to the small shelf by the window. The cracked photograph of Anthony rested there, sunlight touching the glass, illuminating the line that split his smiling face. She had known this would come. The world was never quiet when money was involved, especially not this much money. "No," Evelyn said softly. I'm sorry?" The journalist sounded startled, the energy pausing, searching for the right words. "No interviews," Evelyn repeated. "No statements." There was a pause, only the sound of Evelyn's kettle beginning to boil in the background, a soft rumble rising. "Mrs. Moretti, people will want to know. They will have questions. Don't you think it's important they hear your voice in this?" Evelyn's eyes softened as she looked out the window, where a mother was walking her child down the street, the child's backpack nearly bigger than she was, her small legs working hard to keep up. "Let them talk," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm, each word carrying the weight of a promise. Let the children walk. The journalist tried to speak again, but Evelyn lowered the phone, pressing the red button before placing it back on the table. The kettle whistled, the steam rising, filling the small kitchen with warmth as Evelyn moved slowly to pour her tea, the morning light catching the thin steam like a blessing. Outside, the city was waking up, children stepping onto sidewalks, shoes scuffing, voices rising, backpacks shifting on small shoulders as they began their walk to school, unaware that someone had already cleared the road for them. The community center in Brownsville smelled of coffee and sweat, the air heavy with the closeness of too many bodies in too small a space. Plastic chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as people shifted, voices rising and falling in waves that echoed off the cinderblock walls. The folding tables at the front were covered with flyers, handwritten signs about after-school programs and meal pickups, and a small speaker crackled every time someone adjusted the microphone. Evelyn stood near the back, her hand resting lightly on her cane, her body half hidden behind a pillar. She could see Ms. Rivera at the front, her hair pulled back tightly, papers in hand as she tried to calm the restless crowd. Parents filled the rows of chairs, some with babies on their laps, others with teenagers standing behind them, arms crossed, faces wary. A low hum of conversation ran through the room, thick with uncertainty. "I'm telling you, it's a trick," a man in a worn denim jacket muttered to the woman beside him. "Nothing is free. Nothing." "She's an angel," a grandmother in the front row whispered, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. "You think anyone ever cared like this before?" Near the door, a teenager with a backpack shrugged, whispering to his friend, "If it's real, I'm not turning it down." Ms. Rivera stepped up to the microphone, her voice calm but firm. "This fund will cover tuition for every child in this district, and if we can manage it, beyond. No strings, no hidden papers you need to sign, no debt hanging over your children's heads." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room, parents turning to each other, eyebrows raised. "How long will it last?" someone shouted from the middle row. Ms. Rivera hesitated for a moment, then said, "As long as we can make it last." "It won't last," the man in the denim jacket called out, standing up. "You think we're fools? There's always a catch." A chorus of voices rose, some in agreement, others arguing back, the room filling with the heat of fear and hope crashing against each other like waves against rock. Evelyn felt the energy in the room pressing against her chest, the tension of a community that had learned to question anything that sounded like a promise. She tightened her grip on her cane, her eyes moving over the faces of parents who were tired, who wanted to believe but had been given too many empty words before. She saw a mother rocking a toddler, tears in her eyes as she whispered, "Maybe now, baby, maybe now." Evelyn took a step back, the chatter rising, plastic chairs scraping as people turned to each other, arguing, comforting, hoping. Ms. Rivera tried to speak again, her voice nearly drowned out by the noise. Evelyn turned quietly, slipping out the side door before anyone could notice her, the cool evening air brushing against her face as she stepped outside. She paused for a moment, hearing the voices still echoing inside, then began her slow walk down the sidewalk, the lights of the street lamps guiding her home. Behind her, hope and fear mixed in the crowded room, but Evelyn knew the promise had been made, and that was enough for now. The small apartment smelled of burnt toast and the faint tang of laundry detergent that hadn't quite washed the city air out of the clothes hanging by the window. Morning light pushed through a gap in the curtain, landing in a warm square on the floor where Jamal's little sister sat, her legs crossed, hugging a worn stuffed bear. Jamal, 12, tightened the straps of his heavy backpack, feeling the weight of books and papers pulling at his shoulders. His shoes were scuffed, laces knotted in mismatched lengths, but they were clean, and he had tied them himself that morning while his mother made breakfast. Their mother moved quickly in the small kitchen, flipping the toast that was already too dark, pouring water into 2 mismatched cups, her eyes tired but alert. She glanced over at Jamal, who was holding a pencil like it was something precious, rolling it between his fingers, the yellow paint chipped near the eraser. "Ma," Jamal said quietly, his eyes darting to his sister on the floor, "I don't want to leave her here alone." His mother paused, turning to face him, wiping her hands on a towel. For a moment, the silence in the room was filled only by the rustle of papers in Jamal's backpack and the low rumble of traffic outside. "She'll be okay," his mother said softly, kneeling down in front of him so they were eye level. "You can go now. It's paid." Jamal blinked, not sure he had heard her right. His grip on the pencil tightened, and his breath caught in his chest. "It's paid?" he echoed. She nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder, her thumb brushing a spot on his shirt that she had scrubbed clean the night before. "You can go to school. No waiting, no worrying. You get to be there, Jamal." His little sister looked up, her big eyes wide, the bear's ear clutched in her small hand. She smiled, a gap where her front tooth had fallen out last week. "Go, Jamal," she said, her voice soft but certain. The toast popped, landing crooked on the counter, the smell of it mixing with the warm, dusty air of the apartment. Jamal's heart was pounding, a mixture of fear and something bright he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He turned, pulling the backpack higher on his shoulders, the weight of it grounding him, reminding him he was going somewhere, that he could walk into that building without being sent home, without sitting in the office while his mother made calls that led nowhere. "Thank you, Ma," he whispered, his eyes stinging as he moved toward the door. She kissed the top of his head, smoothing his hair down, her own eyes shining. "Learn, Jamal, that's your job now." He nodded, gripping the pencil like a promise, then opened the door, the hallway cool against his flushed face as he stepped out. He didn't look back, tears slipping quietly down his cheeks as he ran, the backpack bouncing, the pencil held tight in his hand as he rushed toward a future that had finally opened its doors. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the radiator and the flicker of the television screen casting pale light across the room. Shadows moved along the walls, shifting as the images on the screen changed, voices rising and falling, filling the stillness with their steady rhythm. Evelyn sat in her armchair, wrapped in a thick knitted shawl, her hands folded in her lap. The cracked photograph of Anthony rested on the small table beside her, angled so she could see it even as her eyes stayed fixed on the television. On the screen, a young news anchor smiled brightly, papers in hand, her voice calm and practiced. "And in Brownsville today, the first disbursement from the Moretti Education Fund has cleared, ensuring full tuition for over 2,000 students in the city's poorest neighborhoods." Parents and children gathered outside their schools today, many in tears, as they learned they could attend without fear of being turned away. Footage rolled of Jamal, clutching his backpack, a shy smile on his face as he stood among other children, the doors of the school open behind them. Parents held each other, some crying, some laughing, the weight of their worry easing, if only for a moment. Evelyn's eyes glistened, her breath catching as she leaned forward slightly, trying to see every detail. The radiator's warmth filled the room, but her hands felt cold, and she rubbed them together slowly, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers. The anchor's voice continued, "And while the donor remains anonymous, the community is calling them a miracle, an angel who has given their children a future." A small, tired smile touched Evelyn's lips, her gaze drifting to Anthony's photo as if to share the moment with him. The radiator clicked, the soft heat wrapping around her legs, but the effort of sitting forward left her breathing hard, her chest rising and falling unevenly. She tried to stand, pushing herself up with trembling arms, but the room tilted slightly, the edges of her vision going soft. Her hand flew to her chest, pressing against the sharp pain that bloomed there, stealing her breath for a moment. She stood there, hunched, clutching her chest, her breath ragged, the light of the television flickering across her face. The news anchor's voice was distant now, just a gentle hum behind the sound of her labored breathing. But the image of the children, of Jamal's small smile, was still bright in her mind. "Good," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, her lips trembling. "Now I can rest." She lowered herself back into the chair, the exhaustion washing over her like a wave, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment as the warmth of the radiator and the hum of the television filled the room. Outside, the city moved on, children stepping into classrooms, laughter echoing in hallways, futures unfolding quietly, piece by piece, because of the promise she had kept. Evelyn let the smile linger on her lips, the flicker of the television painting gentle light across her face as she closed her eyes, letting herself rest. A 93-year-old woman who once felt powerless leaves a legacy that lives beyond her breath. Children who would have been turned away now walk into schools, clutching pencils like tickets to a different future. Evelyn, who lived quietly and alone, dies with the knowledge she changed countless lives, fulfilling the promise she made to her husband and herself.